It was just another crowded Tuesday morning on the 7:15 bus in downtown Chicago. The kind of morning where everyone's too busy scrolling through their phones or staring out windows to notice what's happening around them. But for one 16-year-old high school student, this ordinary commute was about to become a moment that would change multiple lives forever. Sarah had always been the quiet type, preferring to keep to herself during her bus rides to school. Her earbuds were in as usual, playing her favorite indie playlist, when she noticed an elderly black woman struggling with her grocery bags, making her way down the aisle. What happened next made Sarah's heart sink. Two middle-aged men in business suits were occupying multiple seats with their briefcases and laptops spread out. When the elderly woman politely asked if they could make some space, they pretended not to hear her. Sarah watched as the woman stood there, arms trembling under the weight of her bags, while other passengers awkwardly looked away. Something inside Sarah snapped. Maybe it was remembering her grandmother's stories about standing up for what's right, or maybe it was just basic human decency kicking in. Without overthinking it, she stood up, removed her earbuds, and spoke up loud enough for the entire bus to hear. "Excuse me," her voice shook slightly but grew stronger with each word. "These seats aren't for your briefcases. This woman needs to sit down." The bus fell silent. One of the men glared at her, but Sarah didn't back down. She kept her eyes locked on them, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. What happened next would later be captured in a viral TikTok video that none of them knew was being recorded. The elderly woman, who turned out to be a retired school teacher of 30 years, wasn't just any random passenger. But Sarah wouldn't discover that until the following day, when an unexpected visitor would show up at her high school. The response to Sarah's actions would spark a chain of events that would reach far beyond that morning bus ride. It would remind an entire city that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can ripple out in ways we never expect. But in that moment, Sarah wasn't thinking about going viral or being brave. She was just doing what felt right. Little did she know that the elderly woman's grandson was a prominent local business owner who had been trying to find ways to give back to the community. When he heard about what happened on the bus that morning, he knew exactly where to start. But that's only the beginning of how this story unfolds. As the bus continued its route that morning, no one could have predicted how a simple act of standing up for a stranger would lead to a surprise that would not only change Sarah's life, but inspire thousands of others. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from ordinary days, and sometimes the biggest impacts start with the smallest choices. This is a story about more than just doing the right thing. It's about the connections we make when we least expect them, the courage to speak up when others stay silent, and how one moment of kindness can set off a chain reaction that touches countless lives. But first, let's go back to what happened when those businessmen finally looked up from their phones and realized the entire bus was watching. The tension on the bus was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers had lowered their phones, and someone in the back had even pulled out their earbuds. The two businessmen shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that every pair of eyes on the bus was fixed on them. The younger of the two men cleared his throat and began hastily gathering his papers. We were just about to pack up anyway," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact as he shoved documents into his briefcase. His colleague followed suit, their previous air of importance deflating with each passing second. As they made space, Sarah gently helped the elderly woman with her grocery bags and made sure she was comfortably seated. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, a retired teacher who had spent 3 decades teaching at Lincoln High School. Her warm smile and gentle demeanor immediately put Sarah at ease. "You remind me of my students," Mrs. Thompson said softly, "the ones who weren't afraid to stand up for what they believed in." What Sarah didn't know was that among the silent witnesses on the bus that morning was a local journalist who had been having the worst week of her career. Questioning whether she should even continue in journalism, she had been ready to submit her resignation letter that very morning. But watching this simple act of courage unfold gave her an idea that would eventually become one of the most impactful stories of her career. As the bus continued its route, Mrs. Thompson shared stories from her teaching days, speaking about how she had always encouraged her students to show kindness, even when it wasn't the easy choice. She told Sarah about her grandson, who had started with a small food truck and built it into a successful chain of restaurants across the city. He always says success means nothing if you don't use it to lift others up, she explained. The businessmen had moved to the back of the bus, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. One of them kept glancing over, as if wanting to say something, but pride or embarrassment held him back. The other passengers had returned to their phones, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Small smiles and knowing looks were exchanged, as if they had all shared in something special. What happened next would spread across social media like wildfire, not because of the confrontation, but because of what Mrs. Thompson did just before her stop. She reached into her bag and pulled out something that made several passengers gasp. But the true significance of this moment wouldn't become clear until the following day. As Sarah helped Mrs. Thompson gather her groceries when her stop approached, the elderly woman pressed a small envelope into her hand. "Don't open this until tomorrow," she whispered with a mysterious smile. Sometimes the universe has a way of making sure kindness finds its way back to those who share it. Sarah slipped the envelope into her backpack, curious but respecting Mrs. Thompson's request. She couldn't have known that at that very moment, Mrs. Thompson was already texting her grandson, setting in motion a series of events that would not only change Sarah's life, but inspire a movement across the city. The bus ride that morning was more than just a moment of standing up against injustice. It was about to become a catalyst for something much bigger, something that would remind an entire community about the power of small acts of kindness. But before that could happen, there was the matter of that mysterious envelope and the unexpected visitor who would show up at Sarah's school the very next day. The next morning started like any other school day for Sarah, except for the weight of that mysterious envelope in her backpack. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events on the bus, wondering what Mrs. Thompson could have possibly given her. As she walked through the school hallways, her phone buzzed with messages from friends sharing a viral video. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was footage from yesterday's bus incident. The video had already gained over 100,000 views overnight. Comments were pouring in from all over the city, with people sharing their own stories of witnessing discrimination and regretting their silence. Sarah felt overwhelmed seeing herself on screen, but what caught her attention were the comments mentioning Mrs. Thompson's name. Apparently, she wasn't just any retired teacher. She had been a legendary figure at multiple schools across the city, known for her dedication to underprivileged students. During third period, an announcement came over the intercom asking Sarah to come to the principal's office. Her classmates whispered and stared as she gathered her things, her hands slightly shaking. In the hallway, she finally pulled out the envelope Mrs. Thompson had given her. Inside was a handwritten note and what looked like an old photograph from the 1960s. The note read, "Dear Sarah, this photo was taken the day someone stood up for me on a bus, much like you did yesterday. That person changed my life, and I became a teacher because of their courage. Now it's my turn to pass on the legacy of kindness. My grandson will be visiting your school today. What happens next is entirely up to you." As Sarah approached the principal's office, she could hear multiple voices inside. Through the frosted glass, she could make out several figures, including what appeared to be a news crew setting up cameras. Her heart pounded in her chest. The photograph in her hand showed a young Mrs. Thompson standing next to someone who looked surprisingly familiar. Just then, her phone buzzed again. The video had been picked up by local news stations, and people were starting to recognize her from the bus. But there was something else catching viewers' attention. One of the businessmen from the bus had posted a public apology video that was also going viral. In it, he revealed something about his own past that would connect to Mrs. Thompson's story in an unexpected way. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Inside that office waited not just Mrs. Thompson's grandson, but a revelation that would tie together past and present in a way nobody could have predicted. The photograph in her hand held a clue to a decades-old story of courage and kindness that was about to come full circle. Before she could open the door, she heard Mrs. Thompson's familiar voice from inside the office. But what the beloved retired teacher was about to reveal would leave everyone in that room speechless. The story of yesterday's bus ride was about to become part of something much bigger, a legacy of courage that had been quietly shaping their city for generations. Taking a deep breath, Sarah turned the handle. The next few minutes would not only change her life, but would inspire a movement that would spread far beyond their city. As the door swung open, the cameras turned to face her, and Mrs. Thompson's grandson stood up with tears in his eyes, holding something that made Sarah's jaw drop. In Mrs. Thompson's grandson's hands was a weathered bus pass from 1964, preserved in a small frame. But it wasn't just any bus pass. It belonged to Sarah's grandmother, Claire Henderson, the same grandmother who had raised Sarah to stand up for what's right, who had passed away just last year. Suddenly, the familiar face in Mrs. Thompson's old photograph made perfect sense. "Your grandmother was the person who stood up for me that day," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "She was just a teenager too, not much older than you are now." The news crew watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Thompson explained how Claire Henderson's act of courage had inspired her to become a teacher, leading to a 40-year career that touched thousands of lives. But before Sarah could process this revelation, the principal's office door opened again. To everyone's surprise, one of the businessmen from yesterday's bus walked in. It was the one who had posted the apology video, and he was holding a folder of old newspaper clippings. His hands were shaking as he explained that Mrs. Thompson had been his teacher in middle school, back when he was a troubled kid from a broken home. "I didn't recognize you yesterday," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But after watching the video last night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how you changed my life all those years ago, Mrs. Thompson. You were the only teacher who believed in me when everyone else had given up." The businessman, now identified as Michael Chen, revealed that his company had been secretly planning to launch a major scholarship program for underprivileged students. Just then, Sarah's phone lit up with another notification. The viral video had caught the attention of a national news network, but they weren't just interested in yesterday's bus incident. They had uncovered a series of similar acts of courage across the city over the past few months, all connected in an unexpected way to students Mrs. Thompson had taught over her long career. Mrs. Thompson's grandson stepped forward, explaining that his successful restaurant chain was just part of a larger mission. He had been tracking these stories, building a network of former students who were paying forward the kindness his grandmother had inspired. But what he revealed next left everyone in the room speechless. The scholarship program Michael Chen was planning wasn't just any ordinary fund. It was going to be named after Claire Henderson, Sarah's grandmother, in honor of that day in 1964. But there was still one detail about Claire's story that Mrs. Thompson hadn't shared. A truth that would explain why Sarah's simple act of courage on the bus had meant so much more than anyone realized. As Mrs. Thompson opened her purse to retrieve one final piece of evidence, a small crowd of students had gathered outside the principal's office window, their phones raised, streaming the unfolding events live. The story of courage that had started on a bus in 1964, echoed on another bus in 2024, was about to reveal its most surprising connection yet. Mrs. Thompson held up what appeared to be an old letter, its edges worn with age. "Your grandmother wrote this to me the day after she stood up for me," she began, her voice trembling. "But she made me promise not to share its contents until the right moment. Sarah, after 60 years, I believe that moment has finally arrived." Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed letter. The room fell silent as she began to read Claire's words from 1964. "Dear Rose, today on the bus wasn't the first time we met. 10 years ago, when I was just 6 years old, a kind black nurse saved my life during the hospital fire. That nurse was your mother. I recognized your face from the photo she kept on her desk. Today wasn't about courage. It was about repaying a debt of kindness that saved my life." Sarah's legs felt weak as the connection became clear. The hospital fire of 1954 was a famous part of city history, where multiple lives were saved by the heroic actions of the staff. Her grandmother had rarely spoken about surviving that fire, but she had always kept a small burnt teddy bear as a reminder. Mrs. Thompson wiped tears from her eyes as she continued. "But what Claire never knew was that my mother came home that night and told me about the little girl she saved. She said that girl's smile gave her the strength to go back into the burning building 3 more times to save others. That little girl's courage inspired my mother, who inspired me, and now," she looked at Sarah with pride. The circle continues. Michael Chen stepped forward, his business demeanor completely gone. "The scholarship program isn't just about money," he explained. "We're creating the Henderson Thompson Legacy Project. It's a citywide initiative to document and celebrate everyday acts of courage, connecting them to create lasting change. But we needed a spark to launch it. Something to show people that these small moments matter. Sarah, you gave us that spark." Mrs. Thompson's grandson revealed the full scope of their plan. Every student who performs a documented act of kindness or courage would be eligible for mentorship from successful professionals like Michael Chen. The mentors would be drawn from a network of Mrs. Thompson's former students, creating a chain of support that could lift entire communities. But just as the weight of this revelation settled in the room, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. The crowd of students who had been watching through the window had grown enormous. They were all holding up their phones, but they weren't just recording. They were showing their screens. Each display showed a different video of someone standing up for others, inspired by Sarah's viral moment. "This is more than a story about one brave act," Mrs. Thompson said, standing tall despite her age. "This is about how courage creates courage, how kindness echoes through generations. Your grandmother saved lives by being brave enough to smile in the face of fear. You saved something just as precious yesterday, hope." The local news crew had already started packing up, realizing this story had grown beyond their scope. But Sarah barely noticed them leaving. Her attention was caught by something falling out of her grandmother's letter. A small, singed piece of paper with a child's drawing. It showed two stick figures holding hands, one small and one tall, standing before what looked like flames. As tears rolled down her cheeks, Sarah finally understood why her grandmother had always told her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being kind when kindness was hardest. The story that began with a simple bus ride had revealed a 60-year legacy of interwoven lives, each touched by courage, each passing it forward. But as Mrs. Thompson picked up the fallen drawing, she noticed something on its back that no one had seen before. A message that would launch their story in an entirely unexpected direction, proving that even now, this tale of interconnected courage still had one more surprising chapter to reveal. On the back of the child's drawing was a simple message written in faded blue crayon. "To the brave nurse who saved me. When I grow up, I want to save people too." Underneath, in more recent handwriting, Claire had added, "Every act of kindness starts a story that never really ends." The Henderson Thompson Legacy Project launched the following week, but it looked very different from what Michael Chen had originally planned. Instead of a traditional scholarship program, it evolved into a community movement. The project team created an app where people could document their experiences of everyday courage, connecting them to a growing web of kindness across the city. Sarah's viral bus moment had sparked something remarkable. Schools across the city began incorporating courage curriculum into their programs, teaching students that bravery isn't just about grand gestures. It's about small acts of kindness that ripple outward. Mrs. Thompson became a regular speaker, sharing her story and the generations of interconnected lives it had touched. The two businessmen from the bus became unexpected allies in the movement. Michael Chen's company partnered with local businesses to create internship opportunities for students who demonstrated everyday courage. The other businessman, inspired by his colleagues' transformation, established a grant program for teachers who went above and beyond to support their students, naming it in honor of Mrs. Thompson. But perhaps the most beautiful outcome was what happened on that same bus route. Regular commuters started saving seats for elderly passengers without being asked. People began looking up from their phones, noticing when others needed help. The simple act of paying attention to those around you became contagious. 6 months after that fateful bus ride, Sarah stood on a stage at the city's first Courage Convention, surrounded by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the movement. She held up her grandmother's burned teddy bear, now a symbol of how courage can spark courage, kindness can inspire kindness, and how one small moment can grow into something extraordinary. "My grandmother always said that courage isn't about being fearless," Sarah told the crowd. It's about being kind when kindness is hardest. She was right, but she forgot to mention something important. Courage is also contagious. Every time we choose to be brave, we make it a little easier for someone else to be brave too. Mrs. Thompson joined her on stage, along with Michael Chen and dozens of others whose lives had been woven into their story. Together, they unveiled a Newsteady monument, a simple bronze statue of two people on a bus, one standing, one seated, their hands clasped in a moment of shared humanity. The statue's base bore an inscription taken from Claire's letter. "Kindness saved my life once. Today, I pass it on." Below it, thousands of small metal plates would be added over the years, each bearing the name of someone who had continued the legacy of everyday courage. As the story of the bus ride spread beyond the city, similar movements began sprouting up across the country. But for Sarah, the most meaningful impact was much closer to home. Every morning, as she rode the bus to school, she watched people looking out for each other, standing up for each other, carrying forward a legacy that had started long before she was born. And so, a story that began with a simple choice on a crowded bus became a reminder that the most powerful changes often start with the smallest acts of courage. As Mrs. Thompson always says now, with a knowing smile, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply notice when someone needs us to be brave for them.